Hello and welcome to Where the Bush is Burning. I'm your host, Tom Tice. Each week we gather together and have a conversation about Christ. I appreciate the fact that you have decided to join today, and certainly appreciate all of you who very faithfully watch the videos that we produce each week. So, thank you once again for being here today at Where the Bush is Burning. And we're going to dive into a conversation about Christ today that is probably appropriate, I suppose, for the season. If you follow the religious calendar, I don't frankly follow it very closely myself, but I'm cognitively aware, certainly, that there are various times of the year when the religious calendar dictates that certain things be discussed. And so the result of that is, obviously, it becomes appropriate for us to take some opportunity to discuss whatever subject is raised by the particular occasion. And so during the Christmas season, during the end of December, we tend to discuss the incarnation. And at this time of the year, it being Easter according to the religious calendar, the subject under discussion is very often the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, because so much of what is related to Christianity relates to the resurrection of Christ from the dead. And so I think it's worth our time today to just consider this subject. We've talked about it before. I went back and had a look at some of the videos that we've produced over a period of time over the last year. And in the course of doing that, certainly am aware that we have discussed the resurrection of Christ on more than one occasion. But being that it is the time of year that it is, and we have this opportunity, it's appropriate for us to discuss the resurrection today. So I want us to do that, and it is, once again, another conversation about Christ, much of which is about the whole issue of, did Christ actually rise from the dead? That is one of the big points of discussion. People have discussed it over the years. People have tried to disprove that he did rise from the dead. It is critically important to the rest of Christianity and the beliefs that are associated with it that we affirm that Christ did rise from the dead. This is something that we do believe. And the question is, well, okay, you believe that Christ rose from the dead. On what foundation is that? Why do you believe that that is true? And not just a legend, or not just a story, or not just a very elaborate, long-running lie. Why do you believe that Christ rose from the dead? And if we go back to the accounts that were written about the life of Christ, we go back to the Gospels. All of the Gospels, all four of them, affirm that Christ rose from the dead. All of them have some recording of the incidents that surround it. The three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tend to look at it relatively similarly. They are called the Synoptic Gospels. That is, that they tend to view things with similar or views, or the same eye, if you want to use the word synoptic. And then you have John, who also records the resurrection and incidents that follow it, and he also makes reference to the fact that Christ did rise from the dead and that he saw him, and the other disciples affirm the same. Now then, if you then go on from the Gospels into the book of Acts, in the book of Acts, you have this incident which occurs where Christ appears to his disciples. They walk out to the Mount of Olives. He has this conversation with them, telling them that they should go to Jerusalem, that they should wait. The Holy Spirit was going to descend upon them. And that when the Holy Spirit did descend upon them, that they would have power to be witnesses of him in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. Well, the next chapter delineates how that occurred. And in the process of that discussion, or that narration, I should say, the Holy Spirit descends upon them on the day of Pentecost. Peter stands up. He begins to speak to those people who were gathered there. Other disciples are given the remarkable ability to speak in foreign languages, which they had not acquired by study, and so they then begin to communicate the gospel. And one of the key things that you find in the first preaching of Peter, beginning in chapter 2 and then continuing on through the first 12 chapters, Peter figures very largely in those chapters and has quite a lot to say. One of the key features of his initial address has to do with the resurrection of Christ from the dead. And that is a key point. And then also, as you go on into chapter 3 and the rest of the accounts that we find between chapter 2 and chapter 12, there is this constant reference to Christ as having risen from the dead. Now then, in chapter 13, by that point, Saul of Tarsus has been converted. He is sent then in chapter 13 on his first missionary journey. This Saul of Tarsus is the one that we know as Paul the Apostle. And once again, the whole discussion is very much about Christ and Christ having risen from the dead. And you find that all the way through. In fact, one of the key things that happens later on in Paul's experience is it eventually goes up to Jerusalem. He is there arrested. He's brought before the Sanhedrin, and or the Sanhedrin, depending on how you like to pronounce that. So he's brought before the ruling body of the Jews, which is comprised of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They are all there together. The Pharisees were the religious conservatives of their day. They believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees were religiously more liberal as far as their theology went. They did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. They were very hard-minded, very money-oriented people. They did not believe in that. In that particular situation where Paul was brought before them, he, recognizing that some of them were Pharisees and the others were Sadducees, made this particular point that it was of the hope of the resurrection of the dead that he was being called in question. This had reference to Christ's resurrection from the dead. Now then, there was an uproar, and the net result of that was he was taken into custody by the Romans. The Romans then found out about a plot because they were tipped off that he was going to be assassinated by the Jews. They spirited him away by night, and eventually he landed under the auspices or in the care of a Roman ruler called Felix. Felix then passed him off to another one called Festus, and Festus then did not know quite what to do with him, and King Agrippa came along and with his wife, and Festus tried to get Agrippa, or wanted to have Agrippa hear what Paul had to say. And he makes a very interesting comment about this discussion. And the comment is worth reading because it comes in the book of Acts where he is talking, and Festus says, chapter 25, therefore when they had come together without any delay the next day, I sat on the judgment seat, commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no such accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. So the resurrection, interestingly enough, became the issue that was at stake as far as Festus was concerned. Now, Festus was he didn't care about Jewish religion to speak of. Wasn't particularly important to him, but Felix had left him this prisoner, and now he had to do something with him. And Paul had by this time appealed to go be seen before Caesar, and as a Roman citizen, he had the right to do that. Festus says, look, this is the issue. The issue is about this Jesus who died and whom Paul affirms to be alive. So once again, the issue as so far as Paul was concerned was the resurrection of the dead, and the resurrection of Christ very specifically. Now then, when we go over to read what Paul writes. Once again, the resurrection of Christ from the dead is a very significant thing. And Paul goes to great lengths to point out that this issue or this matter of Christ being raised from the dead was not something that happened to one or two people, that there were many people who were witnesses to the fact that Christ had risen from the dead. Not in some sort of mass hysterical presentation, but that they saw him under various circumstances. And the Apostle Paul, once again, in writing in 1 Corinthians, which is a chapter which deals quite heavily with the whole discussion of the resurrection. And in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, he says, and I'll begin in verse 3, "For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures." Then he goes on to make these statements, that he was seen by Cephas, who is Peter, then by the 12, and that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep, that is, some have died. After that, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then, last of all, he was seen by me also, as one born out of due time. So, here Paul is saying, look, here's a list of these people who saw Christ alive from the dead. Now, once again, Luke made reference to it in Acts chapter 1. Peter made reference to it in Acts chapter 2, and throughout the various things that he has to say in between Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 12. The Apostle Paul starts talking about the resurrection. He talks about it all the way through the rest of the book of Acts. He starts to write. He writes about the resurrection of Christ from the dead. And so there's this constant refrain throughout the New Testament from more than one of the disciples, more than one of the apostles. The Apostle Paul writing very articulately and listing very specifically the number of people who saw Christ alive from the dead. Now you get all the way over to the end of the rest of the New Testament and you land in Revelation chapter 1. There John is writing, as John is writing, he talks about this interaction that he has with the glorified Christ. In that interaction, he records these words coming from Christ. "I am he that lives and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. I have the keys of hell and of death." And so the passage goes on. The important part about that for our purposes is that, once again, here John is writing and saying, this is my personal experience. This is what I saw. This is what I heard. And he talks about Christ as having been raised from the dead and articulating the words that I just repeated to you. So the key issue or the key thing that we want to draw out of this is that there is a multiplicity of witnesses, all of whom agree that they saw Christ alive from the dead. Now, this is important because they personally testified of this, and we accept their testimony. So it was a number of people, not just a few, under different circumstances, in different contexts, at different times, and all of them affirmed the same thing. Yes, we saw Christ raised or alive after he had died. We saw the resurrected Christ alive from the dead. Now, for our purposes, this is significant because everything that is connected to Christ as far as its incarnation and everything that he has promised subsequent to his resurrection, that is everything he has promised that he is doing now or that he will be doing in the future, rests upon this one foundational issue, that he has risen from the dead. So he said to when he was in controversy in John chapter 2, he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They misunderstood what he was talking about, took him very literally, thought he was talking about the temple at Jerusalem. He was talking about the temple of his body. So he personally subscribed to the idea before it ever happened that he would indeed rise from the dead. He promoted this idea, and then subsequent to that revealed himself consistently after the fact to a number of people. It doesn't matter whether you talk about the two on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24, the disciples, this 500 people who were gathered together, the disciples that went with him out to the Mount of Olives and saw him ascend back into heaven. All of these people who lived during this period of time, who wrote about the experiences that they had with the risen Christ, all of these people agree about this fact. So therefore, we subscribe to this fact as well. We agree with them, we believe them, and we believe that as a result of the fact that Christ is risen from the dead, that all of the other things that he has promised, he will indeed fulfill. Do we believe that he is, as the writer of Hebrews says, even now ever living to make intercession for us? Yes. Do we believe that he is going to return according to John in Revelation chapter 19? Yes, he is going to return. Do we believe that, as he has said, he's going to judge the living and the dead, from Matthew 25 when he described his return? Yes, we believe all those things. All of these things rest upon the fact that Christ has risen from the dead. We do believe what the Apostle Paul writes in the rest of 1 Corinthians 15, that he indeed is sitting at the right hand of the throne of God, that he's now sitting there waiting for all his enemies to be made his footstool, that the last enemy that he will destroy is death. We believe all these things, and they rest upon the fact that Christ is risen from the dead. So, what would I like for you to believe? Well, I think that based on the evidence, I think it would be a good thing for you to carefully consider the resurrection if you have not thus far done so, and to be greatly assured and encouraged if you have and do believe in the resurrection, that all these things are in fact so, and that if he has been raised from the dead and is currently living, that all the other things that he has promised will indeed also come to pass. He said, I will come again to receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. These are all things which Christ has promised. These are all things which we may expect, and they rest upon this foundation that he has risen from the dead. So at this particular time of year, I want you to be encouraged. I want you to be uplifted. I want you to enjoy the fact that he has indeed risen from the dead, and that everything that he has promised will indeed come to pass. He has been thus far as good as his word. And we have every expectation to believe that what he has promised, he will do. And so enjoy this period of time when we dwell upon the resurrection, contemplate the truth of it. Feel free to study it out for yourself. That would be lovely. And take heart. Christ is risen from the dead. If he is risen from the dead, everything else that he has promised will infallibly come to pass. Once again, I'm your host, Tom Tice. This is Where the Bush is Burning. We come to you every week and spend some time having a conversation about Christ. Thank you for joining us this morning, and I trust that you will do so. Like and subscribe. That would be lovely. If you want to receive our devotional, you may find it at hopeharbor.church. That's Hope Harbor, all one word, .church. And you can read the devotional. It comes out every day, somewhere around the 6, 7 o'clock Rocky Mountain time. So you're welcome to read that. You can subscribe to it through Substack. It'll come in your email. You can also subscribe to it for your email through hopeharbor.church. We also put up an audio message once a week, and we'd love to have you listen to that if that's something that you would find useful. Join us again next week at Where the Bush is Burning as we have another conversation about Christ. And I trust that you today will rejoice that he is risen indeed.